Good morning. I think we're ready to resume with Dr.
Peters. Indeed, my Lord.
Good morning, Dr. Peters. I think we're ready to resume. Mr. Connell.
Obliged, my Lord. Now, when we left off, just to go back to your witness statement and use it as a general guide to take us forward, we were at paragraph 74. That will be something like 131. Just make sure we get back to it. No, 74. Yeah, let's go on to the next page, 130. Just to get the context here, in July 2016, Dr. Wright was no longer an ICD, and you were sharing the sector ICD role with Dr. Inkster, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, there are a couple of incidents that follow thereafter that I don't think I need to take from you in any detail. You've been brought in, I see, to check the consequences of fungal growth in rooms in 2A. And then you had a discussion, if we see further down that page, paragraph 77 and 78, about problems that you found in room 25. And that's really a point you make, simply to say that if you have an alarm system indicating pressure issues, then you would know about it without having to find it in other ways. Is that right?
Yes, and furthermore, doing air sampling regularly, you may pick up these problems earlier as well, rather than waiting for an infection. So
And you understand that's not currently being done on Ward 2A, is that right?
that's my understanding.
Now, if we go on to 131, paragraph 79, we come on to a topic that you've already indicated is not your specialist area, which is chilled beams, that you were copied into an email about water dripping from chilled beams, which was said to be due to condensation. And you say you were in touch with Mr. Hoffman, who had a view on this, and we can ask him in due course about that when he comes to help the inquiry. So I won't trouble to take you through that paragraph. So moving on to October 2016, it seems a long time since 2014, but anyway, we're now in October 2016, and this is the point at which, at long last, you are allowed to step back from your infection control remit, or at least your official infection control remit, because a colleague from elsewhere came on board, and you provided a handover. Now, the point you make, I think, in 81, if I'm right, is that even though you're not an ICD, you're still doing ICD duties sometimes. Is that right?
Yes, to out of hours, weekends, public holidays, and cover annual leave of the infection control doctors. And sometimes I was asked to assist with specific tasks.
Who would typically ask you to do that?
Typically, Dr. Inkster would ask me.
Thank you. No doubt that's for the reason you told us yesterday, that you had a particular interest in ventilation, whereas Dr. Inkster's perhaps larger interest was in water. Is that right?
Yes, generally speaking, yes. Or it could be because of time pressures for the ICD team, and I think that speaks to all the microbiologists being a team and infection control being a job for the whole team. So you would try and support if there was a lot of issues in infection control, then we would try and arrange the rota so that we could assist. And generally speaking, others weren't as keen to do infection control at all, so I would step into or be invited to assist.
Thank you. We can go on to 132. Again, this is something I'm not going to take from you in any detail, Dr. Peters. But you're talking here about something called Mycobacterium abscessus, which you say is similar to TB, and you were trying to work out whether the problem was historic or was ongoing, and you prepared a report. Do I understand that the purpose of mentioning this is to indicate another issue where you had difficulty getting the information you thought you needed to find out the answer?
Yes, it was a very significant issue, and it was extremely difficult to get basic levels of information when people had already investigated over a number of years. There was, as far as whole genome sequencing, data, timelines, investigations that were already there and that were not disclosed, not shared, despite people knowing that's what I was looking at. And that really hindered the ability to ensure that things were in place currently in the building to make sure that we didn't have a current problem. So that's
I can
why,
understand that.
yeah, and it was, again, Prof. Jones suggested if I was saying these things, I would have to write it up in a way that could be shared with Dr. Cruikshank.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we moved to April 2017, and whatever has happened in the past, it appears you then take over the role of clinical lead for microbiology from Professor Leonard, and you're asked to start doing some integrating work, and I think we have other evidence coming about how at times pediatrics and adult microbiology had been separate, and you were asked to try and pull them all together. Is that right?
Yeah, so historically, the York Hill had a very independent setup with both the microbiology lab, and they had a staff of 3 or 4 clinical scientists who worked with Craig Williams and Alison Balfour as the clinical microbiologists. And while the labs had integrated on site at the Queen Elizabeth, the clinical liaison hadn't. Although prior to me officially trying to harmonise or to bring together the 2 teams, we had mainly Prof. Jones and another colleague who would primarily do the microbiology liaison with pediatrics, but we had separate rotas. They were sort of clinically separate, and I think for contingency and support, peer support, it was thought to be a good idea to bring them together. And also we had lost 3 of the clinical scientists, so that workforce had really been decimated. So it was really about trying to absorb that work into the rest of the microbiology team.
Thank you. Now, I just want to take briefly from you a reference you then go on to make. You talk about being called to a particular patient who had a particular gram-negative bacteria and then handing it back, but subsequently something new has come to your attention which you wanted to mention to the inquiry about the connection between that case and possibly other ones. Is that right? I think we see that set out in paragraph 85, which runs on to 133. It's the name that I always struggle to get my tongue round. Stenotrophomonas.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, it's not an unheard of organism. It's very well understood, and you know, we isolate it from time to time, but not from bacteremias very often, and it has a significance in this patient cohort. It's much more pathogenic. So if you got a Stenotrophomonas in a blood culture in a different patient cohort, you wouldn't expect it to be so serious. But in this patient cohort, it has a higher mortality rate, and we hadn't seen it in bacteremias. I think there was 18 months or a long run of not seeing it in that patient group. And at the start of what I began to realise that there were bacteremias at a level that was higher than normal would be about that time when I was on call over the weekend. And what's interesting about that patient and what's significant is that the typing at the time had it as unique. But then over time, a number of years later, we send other samples, and I would always type Stenotrophomonas from cystic fibrosis sputum samples, just to make sure that we don't have cross-transmission or issues in the CF cohort, where it's also got particular clinical significance. It was reported as a match to this case. Now, if you looked at a database, it would come up as unique for that original bacteremia. But retrospectively, we now have a match in a different patient cohort. But we don't see, because I look at all the Stenotrophomonas typing, we don't often see matches. And the reference lab in Colindale will comment on, this is striking. I think that was the word that was used for this. This is an unusual thing that a number of years later, the same type, because Stenotrophomonas is a very plastic organism genetically. It changes very, very quickly. And even within one CF lung, you can have huge diversity. So even in one patient, you can have very big genomic differences. So I think that was striking. But at that time, we didn't have that information. And all that I noted on call, because on call at the weekend, you covered pediatrics. And at that time, I hadn't been covering pediatrics. I just handed over to infection control and the pediatric team, here's what we've got. And there were 6 cases, and that seemed to me, having covered a lot of weekends over my years in microbiology, that was a lot. Sorry.
That's a lot of information. Mr. Connell, could I ask you to
I think what I'm trying to,
to the
what I'm keen to get at is what this means or might mean. So you have an isolate which is very specific, marked as unique, and then some years later you find the precisely same isolate, as I understand it, in other samples. Is that right?
Yes, not precisely the same. So it's the same type.
Right.
So it depends how much detail you want on typing systems, or if you'll get that from someone else. But from my point of view, that's something that really you need to think of an explanation. And it's not the only explanation, but a serious contender is that there is somewhere in the environment a source that has these different patient groups have been exposed to over time. And because it's such a plastic organism, it would fit with something like biofilm, where it changes and doesn't become quite so changeable because it's gone into a quiescent biofilm phase of its life cycle. So that's why it's striking, is that over a long period of time, you have a very similar, not precisely identical organism. And it was actually one of 3. So there's 3 linked to our, when I say hospital, the premises, so either the big building or the small building, and over a number of years in different patient cohorts. It's hard to explain that. Strange things happen. You can say, well, that's something that you can just chalk up as that's odd, or you can be alert and think that it fits with the idea of a water source that has biofilm in it. It certainly fits with that.
Thank you. The issue that you're highlighting, in a sense, here, apart from the fact that this is a striking matter that perhaps ought to be investigated, is that to investigate it, you probably need to do more typing. Is that right? Which wasn't regarded as a priority after a lot of the events that we've been through.
I think this is really at the core of a lot of the controversy around typing and what it means. And the typing, in and of itself, a standalone typing means nothing. You have to understand what the idea is of where the organism has come from and how it's behaving. So in order to understand the genetic diversity within the whole water system, you need to have taken an awful lot of samples. And also the how of that water system being contaminated really matters as well. So if you think it's one, you've only ever had a problem with one outlet, then you're going to expect much less diversity, and you're going to expect all the patients to have had exposure to that one same tap. Whereas in the context of the Queen Elizabeth, where there appears to have been right at the beginning, when you were making building, the pipes getting contaminated with lots of potential different sources, you're going to expect a lot of genetic diversity right from the start. And then it's being seeded through into a tank where there's potential for biofilm, and then it's being seeded through without any filter at one point, and we don't know how long for, and then could potentially go anywhere within the system, could potentially build up biofilm at any point in a bit of pipe that's, or with the sealant that's a bit wrong and is giving it a carbon source, or within the taps, and then there's the wrong temperatures, and then there's the not flushing, it's been wet system for a year. So we don't actually know the full extent of the diversity, particularly for, say, one organism, Stenotrophomonas, and then how that's evolved over 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So you always fit the typing into the context of where the patient is. So, for example, if a patient's come in, and we do screen in our hematology oncology patients, when they come in, we do screening to see if they are already carrying organisms like Stenotrophomonas. If we haven't grown it on screening on admission and they've not been unwell, and then sometime later they become bacteremic, and then you get an organism that is a water type organism, it's a very sensible idea to think this could have come from our water system as a whole. So it's not as simple as this type is unique or not. You take it in a context.
Yes. On a matter of detail, just something you mentioned incidentally, what exactly was the policy on screening on admission? Is that
So we do
regularly done with what cohort of patients?
the BMT patients, the Schehalian patients. So it's been a very long-standing screening system for fecal samples, and say they have wounds or
So what do you say of fecal
wounds.
sample?
Fecal samples, yeah.
Yeah.
Fecal samples to look for fecal carriage. And that was in York Hill, that was in place. Kathleen Harvey-Wood was the one remaining clinical scientist. So she has 40 years experience of pediatric microbiology. And at this point in April, I was really just beginning to start into pediatric microbiology. So those SOPs in the laboratory, so a standard operating procedure in the laboratory for screening is already set up. It's standard. I know Great Ormond Street and other centres also do that. Not every centre, but that has been our practice. And the idea is that you can, both for clinical purposes, so if somebody's got a gentamicin-resistant E. coli, for example, in their feces, and our empirical guidance would be to use gentamicin, you would avoid the use of gentamicin because you already know they're carrying an organism that's very resistant. So we would also pick up Stenotrophomonas, Burkholderia, a lot of these organisms, because they're usually intrinsically resistant.
Could I just repeat that back to?
I'm sorry.
Did you say we would not pick up Stenotrophomonas on a
No, we would.
standard screening?
We would. We would.
Right. As I say, you're giving us quite a lot of information, which I'm delighted to have, but I need to.
Sure.
I mean, if I'm to make anything of it, I've got to essentially follow the headline points that you're wishing to make. Now, I think I've understood what you're saying about the potential genetic variations in particular pathogens, and we've been talking about Stenotrophomonas, my understanding being that you would expect evolution of these bacteria over time. And I think I understand the point that you make about a water system having the potential to provide sources for pathogens such as Stenotrophomonas. I'm not sure that I've got much further in my understanding of what I was hearing as quite a information-full explanation from you. Our starting point was looking at, I think, 2 incidences of Stenotrophomonas, or perhaps are we talking about 3?
So this is the first case of Stenotrophomonas that I became aware of, and I'm highlighting the fact that information can become available years later that still pertain of relevance to that case. Yeah, I'm saying a lot of things at the same time. The epidemiology was also, I hesitate to use the word unusual, because usual is a context. It depends what patient cohort you're looking at, and also importance varies. But it was important that we were seeing Stenotrophomonas bacteremia, especially by the time you get to 2, because we've not seen any for 18 months. And it's a serious organism in the bloodstream in this patient cohort. So there's a red flag going up in my head about this time. I'm conflating that with the typing, because that has become such a flashpoint for interpretation. And my view is that it's not, you never take even whole genome sequencing, which is the most detailed level of typing you can get. Even that has to be informed by the epidemiology. So the time, place, person, and the clinical history of that particular patient. So as a microbiologist, every single blood culture you get, you do in effect a root cause analysis. You're trying to say, where has this come from? If you'd already grown it in their stool, you knew they were colonized with Stenotrophomonas because they've maybe been in and out of hospital recently with a lot of antibiotics. You might then, and it's a new line that's just been put in, you might then think it was translocation from the gut, which can happen. But if it's somebody who you've not grown steno, we know it's not been around, they've had a long-term line in, and there's other cases in a timeous frame, you then start to think this is more likely, or is tipping you over towards thinking there's an environmental source. Let's check the taps, the water, these things. So you start off in any of these situations, the first step is there may be a problem. And then the next step is to try and work each through with lots of pieces of information, of which typing is one.
If I understand what you go on to say, Dr. Peters, what you've done is you've identified a result and then results years later, which you say were regarded as striking,
Yes.
and a possible source. And pending investigation, no one knows, but a possible source was a water source within the hospital environment. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the only way to do anything about that would be to carry out a much more extensive exercise involving that particular organism, Stenotrophomonas.
Yes.
And at that, after the case note review, you say in your statement, typing of Stenotrophomonas was not encouraged, if I can put to that. So I've been asked to ask you another question about this, this question of typing being discouraged. Can we take it from what you say about that, and I have a number here, Stenotrophomonas case in May 21, Aspergillus late 20, and COVID were not typed because typing was discouraged. Can you help us on that? I know it's a long question, but.
So the Stenotrophomonas, we would, well, I would in CF always type a new one so that we understand the epidemiology in our patient cohort. We're always be on the lookout for possible cross-transmission or a shared source. In hematology oncology, when I say we, I don't know any of my colleagues that I've worked with in pediatrics. We would always, for the duration of my time of involvement with that, get these typed, and Kathleen would always have done that as well. And that is that you can keep an eye on what's going on with what is, a serious pathogen in this patient cohort. And when we were doing that, we were instructed that there was no reason to do it, and that if we found things like a match, as infection control not asked for it specifically, it was up to us to deal with it. So that's the Stenotrophomonas. COVID typing is different. I don't say that it wasn't done. It was COVID became part of a national program of whole genome sequencing. So basically there was a national research initiative that all the samples could be whole genome sequenced, and it informed a lot of government policy. And I was involved in one aspect of it, which was hospital-acquired COVID. And in our site, we were not allowed to include staff samples, whereas other sites like Sheffield, other places did. And you get a lot more information because obviously there's a dynamic between staff and patients for COVID. So that was also an evolving picture. So at the beginning of COVID, you couldn't type. As whole genome sequencing became rapidly shared out across the country, there's huge amounts of whole genome sequencing data. So I was involved in the publication of that information. And even in COVID, even with a virus, the whole genome sequencing in and of itself is not enough. You need the epi data as well to tell you to help you understand what's been going on in terms of transmission. So, and what was the other organism? Aspergillus is not really, I mean, you can type, but it's not, it's more useful if you have a cluster, or because there's so much Aspergillus in the environment, the chances of getting the environmental match with your patient is slim. If you do get the match, it's very meaningful. It is a very strong linking, and there are publications with matches, but there are lots of publications where you have outbreaks and there's no match. You can't find the source because there's so much of it around and diverse.
Yeah, because there's a lot of it in the air, as I understand it.
Yes. So typing is something that is a tool. It's not everything in and of itself.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to May. Now, the first item you deal with under May 17 is, I think, simply an example of an instance where you were asked to help out. You weren't an ICD, but you were happy to help out by offering your expertise as requested by Dr. Inkster, and that's covered in paragraph 87. Yeah. And I don't think I need to read you through that. And then we get the unfortunate event in June, going on to 134 of the witness statement, that Dr. Inkster is diagnosed with lymphoma and has to go on sick leave, which I can imagine, given the things you've said about her expertise, must have caused a bit of a gap. It then appears that whatever the criticisms of you, you were asked if you would take on the lead role. Who asked you?
Brian Jones. So we had a meeting. He was head of service. I met with Brian Jones and the clinical lead in the north, who was Mary McLeod, who's in the same role as I was in the south, and she was in the north, to decide, because this is a huge issue for the service. And Brian Jones asked me, and I explained that it was not something I could take on.
Thank you. In August, we come on to a slightly different issue where you have a slightly different role because you are the line manager for a colleague of yours who essentially, what is set out in paragraph 89 is that this colleague says that they are being pushed to sign off something that they don't feel they have the knowledge or expertise to do.
Yes.
No doubt the kind of issue that you get when a very experienced ICD is not there for unfortunate reasons. But was the point that the person was being pushed to do something that they didn't feel they could do?
Yes, it was a continuum of what we'd experienced and the reason why I wouldn't take on the lead ICD role. I thought that the issues had not yet been dealt with, and importantly, just before Dr. Inkster went off sick, she had been speaking to me about her experience had degenerated within that team as well, to the extent that she was very anxious about going to meetings with Tom Walsh and Sandra Devine. They would meet over at the York Hill site because that's where their offices were. They were not on site. And I had gone to Anne Cruikshank just to discuss, because from a microbiology point of view, and because Dr. Cruikshank had been so involved in the previous history, just for some advice on where to take this up and how to support Teresa. And then, unfortunately, Dr. Inkster became very ill. So I already knew that things were continuing in the same kind of culture. And I'd already had issues with the team, and I didn't think I was the right person to do that, even though, well, it was suggested to me that I had the expertise and that I should take it on. I wasn't worried about you're always learning your entire career, but it wasn't because I wasn't willing to take on responsibility. I didn't think it was safe, and I didn't think the organisation had dealt with those issues. My colleague had been keen to carry on covering Dr. Inkster's local sessions, but not the lead sessions. So that colleague was very clear about their level of expertise, and it was agreed that Brian Jones would take on Teresa's lead role, which included managing the big issues like ventilation and water. So that was the agreement, as far as I understood it. And there were two other ICDs on site. There was Alison Bamford and Dr. Pepe Valaraki. So there were 3 ICDs. So that was quite a good number, actually, on site. So for Brian to cover those big issues and the local ICDs to cover the local issues, but this seemed to be a repeat of what we'd experienced back in 2015, where my colleague was asked to sign off on something that was happening on 4B that he did not understand. And I had done a handover in October highlighting that there had been issues and that he was very, very, very distressed because Prof. Jones had come in over the weekend when he was on call and said, you have to do this, you need to step up, and this other person could speak to it better than me. But as his line manager, that was what was being told to me. So this was not good after what had happened already.
What I was going to ask you was, one of the criticisms that is made of you is to be colloquial, that you stick your nose in where you ought not to stick it. But in this case, this individual, you were his line manager.
Yes.
So in a line management sense, you had a responsibility for him. Do I understand that?
Yes, and I had been put on notice to give as much support as I could to my colleagues, less experienced in infection control colleagues, to give them support. So, you know, I wasn't, even though I wasn't willing to take on the lead role, there was, and I agreed, a sense of professional responsibility to support and give whatever knowledge I had to those members of the infection control team at a very difficult time. And they were very, very busy. And also, so in their microbiology role, I was very careful to not double hat them with the rota. In fact, I took that colleague off our microbiology rota altogether. So we covered the infection control doctors' microbiology sessions to free them up, if you like, to take on all this. So the net loss of Dr. Inkster's sessions were felt by the microbiology service.
So what you tell us in your witness statement at paragraph 89 on page 135 of the electronic version is that as his line manager, you wrote to Dr. Armstrong, who was in turn the line manager for Professor Jones, explaining that there were difficulties again. And in fact, we see from further in your statement that this particular colleague, and we know about this from other evidence, had also encountered difficulty in getting information that they wanted, and ultimately came and said, I really need to get out of this role. Again, I'm being slightly colloquial, but that's what you set out in your statement. Is that correct? Thank you. I think we'll move on to another topic. This is what seems to be a particular incident where there were, as I understand it, building works, to use a neutral term, building works being carried out in Ward 4B. But it turned out that there were patients from haematology were said to be in that ward. Is that right?
Yeah, so this goes back to 4B. So there was work ongoing, which at that point was not clear to any of us.
Yeah, well, you weren't directly involved in planning or organising that work.
No, none at all. It seemed to be different work from what my colleague had been asked to sign off, but Dr. Valaraki had been asked to sign this off. When I say sign off, I mean an HAI scribe. So she asked me to assist. I've got the emails to go up with her because she didn't really have any experience of HAI scribe at that time, and I'm sure that's changed enormously, but at that time, so I went up physically to the ward with her, and there was, given that there were high-risk patients, they're not the highest, so the bone marrow transplant, the allogenics were still back over at the Beatson, but there were autologous transplants and acute leukemics, other high-risk patients who had been moved into 4B, one half of it, and the plan, there was work happening on the other half. When you say half, it's a long arm and it goes round, so there's rooms all round the outside, and so there was patients on one side and the other side there was work being done, and there was a lot of dust in the air. There were sheeting, like just plastic sheeting with zips that were flapping in the wind. The prep room where all the IVs are made up actually was within the space that was supposed to be a scribe space, so the nurses would have to go in and out of the scribe area to use the prep room, which isn't really, well, it's not, that's not a good scribe. So yeah, that was the situation that we walked into.
And what you initially tried to do, you say in paragraph 93, is get some more information about the works from, I think, from Mr. Walsh.
Yes.
And you weren't satisfied that you had anything that helped you. Then you record in paragraph 94 on page 136 of the electronic document that you were discussing with Professor Jones the kind of who should be doing what question again, and he says, well, take it up with Dr. Armstrong.
Yes.
And you then take it up with Dr. Armstrong, who says, well, Professor Jones is in charge of what's going on in 4B.
Yes.
So, in other words, it's down to him. So you went in a circle.
Yes, it was a circle, and at the base of it is there are high-risk patients on a ward where there was an inappropriate scribe, and to do a scribe, you really need to know what the work is. What does it actually entail? Otherwise, you can't possibly mitigate. And the other thing, we had an actual sit-down meeting about it, and I think it was Ian Powery that was there, although I'm not 100% sure, but somebody from Estates was there. And at that point, they said that there was only one air handling unit for the ward, which meant, and then it turned out that what they were doing was leak testing at that particular moment, that particular piece of work. And that would involve having the ventilation off, because you have to push a whole lot of air in and suck a whole lot of air out and measure the difference, just in a brief explanation of it. And so that would mean that all those high-risk patients would have no ACH, zero ACH for that duration of the work. And this for me was a problem. And also the leak testing methodology, which I'd read up a lot on right at the beginning because of the PPL rooms, and it used to be that it was at 20 pascals, you pushed air into the room, and then at 20 pascals you pulled it out. But that had increased to 50 pascals due to Bisria. So that's a huge amount of air, sucking a lot of air from the surrounding corridor. And there was grills in the ceiling that went nowhere other than into the ceiling space. And, 5-6 years of dust up there was being sucked out, because the air to go into the room for the leak testing was now being pulled into the environment. Add that to the fact that you don't have proper solid ceilings, which you should have. And to be fair to Estates, it would be very difficult to achieve negative pressure. So, you go down a tick list on an HAI scribe and you maybe highlight you need a negative pressure. To achieve that in that setting would be very difficult. The best thing would be to move the patients out, the high-risk patients at least. But what I understood had happened was, and I think it was because they're trying to piece this service back together who'd already waited for a long time. So they moved out whatever patients were there, moved the hematology patients back in. So there were multiple levels, I thought, of risk that hadn't been managed. But at that meeting, it was I couldn't get traction on what I was presenting as a risk. And that's where Brian Jones at that meeting said, look, if you've got concerns, take them up with Jennifer Armstrong. So yes, I went in a circle, and I felt there wasn't a way somehow to get acknowledgement and action to.
Can I ask you a question which is not directly connected to dust and air testing, but I've been asked to ask you about it. Do you know whether there is a current SOP for the patient pathway of a BMT patient with an infectious disease? So that the patients that you, I think, described earlier in your evidence as causing particular issues, are you aware whether there's an SOP for that?
At that time, no. Currently, it would be in the patient placement policy. So that should include where those patients should go. And it should be a PPVL room, I think, would be the best accommodation. In the adults, in pediatrics, they do apparently have a negative lobbied room from the patient placement policy. That's how I know. So from the patient placement policy, it says an NP. Also, that room in the Schehalian setting would be the best place. If that's already full, because you've got more than one patient, then you're going to have to risk stratify or what other accommodation you've got, and a PPVL room would be the next best thing.
Again, that's quite a lot of information, and I think it may go beyond the question.
Oh, sorry.
We just start with the question again.
The question was whether there was a patient placement policy for.
There was not at that time.
There wasn't at that time. Is there now? You think
There is
there
a
is now?
patient plus There is a patient placement policy in place now.
And do you know when that came into force, or do you not?
Yes, it was into 2020 because it was Marion Bain who ensured that that was a piece of work that was done.
Thank you.
Could I go back? It's just something I may not have picked up. You were being asked about the situation you discovered in August of 2017 with construction work going on in close vicinity to where patients were in Ward 4B.
Mhm.
Now, I think you mentioned a meeting, but I, first of all, want to confirm, and if I'm right that there was a meeting, could you just tell me when and with whom?
It was as a result of there being work happening up there. There was no minutes as far as I recall. There was Sandra Devine, there was Brian Jones, there was estates people who I just can't visualize who was there. I could dig out some emails around it to clarify.
And would that be about the end of August?
It was in relation to these works starting up on 4B. So it, yeah, I can't say with
Okay.
with the month at all.
And it's at that meeting you describe a difficulty in, the way you put it was getting traction.
Yes.
Now, what I'm interpreting, and tell me if I'm wrong about that, is that the other people at the meeting weren't really understanding that there was any issue.
Yes.
I've got that.
Yes.
Right, thank you.
Sorry.
Mr. Conn.
Now, I think we can probably move through some other paragraphs. On 137 of the electronic bundle in paragraph 98, you describe a situation in which you were trying to organize a meeting. Professor Jones wanted to speak to your colleague didn't want to speak to Professor Jones on his own. There was an email and then something of a shouting session which you recorded. So obviously unfortunate if that is how it happened, but otherwise simply an issue of behavior rather than any other concern.
Yes.
And your point that you make there is at the time you were all struggling in terms of staffing because Dr. Inkster was off,
Yeah.
and there weren't enough people. Now, you go on to deal with the death of an individual patient, but you confirmed you didn't have any direct link to her care. So we can move on past that to 138. In September 2017, to some extent, you've told us about these issues. You got a response from Dr. Armstrong to your email saying Professor Jones is leading on 4B, and you've had a number of communications from your colleague who was clearly struggling with the demands that were being placed on them as an ICD, which leads, I think, to 104 at the bottom of that page, where you probably elaborate on the point I just took from you a moment ago, that Dr. Inkster was off, and then at that point, Dr. Pepe Valaraki, was also off, and your other colleague was having difficulties. So you were really toiling in
Yes.
that area of work. Now, we can move on to 139. We hear there about bacteriomas in 2A in the pediatric intensive care unit and elsewhere, including gram negatives. And you felt there were some quite striking issues emerging, whereas others thought somebody was setting the triggers for notification at the wrong level. Is that correct?
Yes, this was through my colleague who shared those trigger graphs with me, and they were having discussions with what we call the SMT, the Senior Management Team in Infection Control, and they were exercised that they were saying it's just that the trigger is too sensitive, that this is normal.
Just help me with that. This proposition of setting a trigger to be too sensitive, what exactly is meant by that?
So if you use, this was meant to be SPC charts or run charts. So a run chart is just literally cases as they go along. And if you say a trigger is two cases within 2 weeks, a trigger means you're going to look at it, you're going to do something, you're going to have a look at it. It may not mean you progress to a PAG, but you may. It's just the very start point. So, you know, it has to start somewhere. And Teresa had already set the trigger points for these high-risk units. For something like Stenotrophomonas, if you've got a long line of none, and then one, you could argue the first one in itself may cause you to at least have a chat to the nurses. Is there anything different that's going on, or is there something that you're worried about? But that would be, you know, in a situation where you've got really lots of lows. More often you'll have the occasional one, you know, and that does happen. And then by the time you've got a second one within 2 weeks, that's an unusual, that's back to the unusual idea for our centre, our location, our population with all their gut flora coming into our unit. This is different. So that's the trigger point. So there is a subjectivity about it, and there is a, if you had one Ebola, clearly that's a massive incident straight away because of its ramifications. If you have a new strain of Burkholderia, for the sake of argument, that has caused a very unusual sepsis and an overwhelming clinical scenario, then again, there's something different about that, and you've got to be alert. It's not an exact science, that picking up when you think there's a problem. But this too sensitive means that they wanted to, well, at this point, I think there were 6 cases within a few months, having had none for a long time. I think that was not too sensitive. I think that is something that needed to be looked at.
And this is in the context specifically of Stenotrophomonas.
Yes, there was Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter as well. So they had charts for those. Those are the ones that were being monitored, and Serratia, I think. So each centre will maybe keep a closer eye on what matters to their population. So I wouldn't expect trigger runs for an ordinary ward in another hospital. You know, not everybody will have a run chart for Stenotrophomonas. Usually it's not significant. In this cohort, and because we'd already had issues with Serratia previously, our local ICT was keeping a very close eye. Under Teresa had set up this local surveillance for our patient cohort.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump ahead a little. You've picked up a number of points about ongoing problems, but arguably nothing especially novel in them. So could we move to paragraph 108 on 140 of the electronic bundle, where you point out that you were still concerned about a whole range of matters, and you were also in 1110 discussing these with Dr. Redding and also with your other colleague. Yes. And it seemed that you were all in agreement that things weren't being done in the way you thought they should be done. Is that fair?
Yes, and just not, there was no sign that the risk status was being fully acknowledged.
Yeah. And Dr. Redding's view, and we've heard separately from Dr. Redding, but Dr. Redding's view was, well, you should go to whistleblowing stage 1. And then, for practical reasons, you prepared an SBAR with input both from Dr. Redding and from your other colleague, and sent that off. And then there was a meeting fairly shortly thereafter.
Yet.
Now, we do have minutes of the meeting, which we may or may not need to go to. I can see a reference to that. And we've also got your SBAR, but to some extent it may duplicate if we also go to that.
Sure.
So if we just look at your witness statement on 141. Now, in paragraph 113, you turn up for a meeting and you discover there a real galaxy of individuals. And I think you say you were surprised to see so many senior people in a meeting to discuss your SBAR, including Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Loudon, Laura Gardner, Mrs. Devine, and so on and so on. So the meeting starts. You then record. Are you sure about that Dr. Armstrong cuts you off and says you're head of nothing?
Yes. I was very taken aback.
Interesting way of starting a meeting. Anyway, there's also a reference to some emails that you hadn't been given from another team.
Yes.
And then you started to go through a number of the issues that you'd raised in your SBAR, and you deal with them. And I don't want to take you through all of them. But if we could go on to 142, paragraph 118 of your statement, you're back to this issue about PPVL rooms. Now, we've discussed the detail of the points about PPVL rooms in the course of yesterday, so I won't take it from you again. But you're recording here that we, and I'm assuming you're speaking for the three individuals effectively at that time, you said you're not sure what's been done, and infectious diseases consultants are still bothered about this. Is that right?
Yes.
And it appears that here we are in October 2017, moving patients to other hospitals was still happening.
Yes.
So this was infectious diseases patients because the consultants weren't happy with what you had. Is that right?
Yes.
And it appears that Mr. Loudon was upset by this suggestion of a problem. Is that right? You record in 119 he was angry.
Yes.
I mean, is that a correct way to describe how he approached it?
He was sitting exactly opposite me at the meeting, and just the body language and the tone, it was very clear. He said categorically that these PPVL rooms are built to standard. They are built to standard.
Excuse me, Mr. Connell. I'm right in thinking that there are rooms described, at least described as PPVL rooms, both in 4B and in 2A.
Not in 4B, 4C.
4C.
There's two, and in ITU.
ITU.
Critical care, so HDU, ITU in the adult building, PICU in the pediatric building, in Schehallien.
Maybe I should just take this at dictation speed. Right, so in the context of these paragraphs, we're talking about the
4C, two rooms in
4C, 2A?
2A.
Yes.
Adult ITU, adult HDU, pediatric ICU, and I think it's on the third floor as well in Schehallien.
Right.
There's some there. And
these are rooms which you would anticipate would have the same specification or different, or
so they're all built to this PPVL specification. That's what they were delivered, ostensibly delivered as.
Just give me that again to...
PPVL design standard. So the supplement is it HBN? Oh, I can't at this minute
Right.
remember
yeah.
the number, but it's a supplement 1.
Yes, the supplement
Oh,
relation
401,
to,
I think, yeah.
in relation to intensive care rooms.
In relation to isolation rooms.
Isolation rooms. Right. So the discussion applies to all of these.
All.
And I get the specification from the
HPN,
HPM, which I
it's an
should know the
HBN, I
number.
think, for this one, HBN supplement 1, and it is called isolation suites, and that's where
Yeah.
the discussion I had yesterday pertains to all of them.
Thank you.
Now, if we can move on to paragraph 120, I need to ask you something about that, because here you're recording what you say Mrs. Devine says. So Mrs. Devine says ID was a late amendment. I think we know that. And she says that the issues were discussed with HPS at the time, and they agreed to advise the board of what standard these rooms would need to be, and they had a meeting on the 2nd of October, and more information was awaited. Now, just a question of what Mrs. Devine meant and what you knew about what she meant. Was she saying that HPS were involved in the original decision to move, or was this something else?
It wasn't clear to me, and I didn't know about it at that stage. I've subsequently seen some work by Ian Storer, I think there's a report. But yeah, the timeline of that was not clear to me. And then the fact that they'd suddenly got this meeting organised. I mean, it's good, but it does seem like it's associated with us asking questions, and it's a long gap, particularly since it's a big risk to be moving high-risk patients across that turning up at our hospital site and then punting them over to Monklands. That's not an ideal situation, especially because we've got the ID unit, the specialist ID unit in terms of staffing. So we have a really reasonably staffed ID unit. So that's a risk.
Am I right in thinking that you yourself don't know who was involved in advising on the original circumstances and specification of the move of the ID unit? Because I think HPS say they weren't involved at that time, but they had been brought in now to do some work.
The only thing I know is that Craig Williams had mentioned discussions with ID and that it was all sorted right at 2015, early before admission, that was sorted.
Yeah, but that's discussions with infectious diseases, not with.
It was mentioned at the SMT,
well,
just a mention at the SMT. That's all.
Yeah, and your point is, well, the ID unit's been there since we opened, even if it was a late decision to bring it in, and we're moving patients out for a year now, and it seems a bit odd that we're only now talking to HPS.
Yes.
Am I picking that up correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. And you go on to highlight the fact that people who may have infectious diseases were being seen in A&E where there wasn't an isolation facility, and then they were being taken somewhere else, which is the point I think you just made a minute or two ago. And then Anne Harkness comes in and says she's already raised these issues, I assume something to do with the ID issue, with directors, and said, well, unless existing rooms can be modified, we need to build an ID unit, which seems an interesting point to be discussing it. But is that what she was saying?
I think she was saying, yeah, we already know this, so this is not news. My point wasn't that, well, I knew it wasn't news because I'd already escalated things and Anne Harkness knew right back in 2015. I don't think that was my point. My point was we continue to have this risk and nothing's happened to change it. And also I knew, because we do work closely with ID, that this was bothering them also.
Thank you. Going on to 143 of the electronic documented, paragraph 1, 2, 3, you were making a point about placement. Now, you've made this point on a number of occasions, placement of people with particular requirements.
Yeah.
And you saying, well, you really need risk-assessed policies. And Dr. Redding, you record as mentioning high rates of infection and air quality being an issue since 2A opened.
Yes.
Which we know about from elsewhere. And you go back onto the public statement point. But the point that you make at the end there, did you seem to be getting any traction on your point about air quality?
None at all. There was, I think even at that meeting, there was a suggestion that there is no national standard for air sampling. So there's a lot of reference to national standards, but we're the only bone marrow transplant unit for peds and adults in Scotland. So there's highly unlikely to be, and even nationally, it's such a niche specialist situation that most centres evolve their own systems, and we had a highly evolved system with both the old Schehallien and the Beatson, both of which had very well established air sampling regimes, which were excellent, and they even published in Schehallien about its utility and how they reduced Aspergillus cases, excuse me.
Well, we can just move on, I think.
Well, just before we move on,
Sure.
I think you made reference to part of the response of those who you were speaking to was there are no national standards. Now, I have picked up in other material references to there being no national standards in relation to BMT isolation units. Now, is that what was being talked about, or was the suggestion more general that there's no national standards for BMT units?
Yeah, in general.
Right.
But it comes back to the non-specificity of the term an isolation room, because you could say every single room in bone marrow transplant is an isolation room because it's protective isolation. So every single room there. But if you're using a PPVL room, what should you expect in that different ventilation setup in terms of air sampling is not well established. I know Great Ormond Street have those kind of rooms in their bone marrow transplant and are very happy with them and do a lot of sampling, but they have a different setup from us. So I have talked about it with my peers in other centres. But the point being made here was if there's no national standard, you cannot make a claim about it. So we're saying there's problems with air quality. And the answer is, how do you know that? Because there's no national standard.
Well, a possible response to that would be that there is a national standard for areas treating neutropenic patients. Now, would that be a good response or a bad response?
No, because there isn't for air monitoring. So you're talking about agar plates, how many colonies of Aspergillus you're allowed.
Right. So we're talking about monitoring at this stage.
Yes.
Okay.
So air IAQ is now a big thing. Indoor air quality, there's a lot of attention to it now because of COVID. But we already had a lot of knowledge about that because of our decades experience in these settings. So there has been a publication of a paper that some of my colleagues have been involved in about air sampling, which didn't actually include people who had a lot of experience of this, particularly Teresa Inkster. And I think it missed the point about setting up in your specific context and being aware of fluctuations, something that's different. And you start to see trends. And if you see any case, one case of Aspergillus, because it's so serious for that cohort, you have to look for potential leaks and maybe there's building work going on nearby. Very, very well established risk for aspergillosis, so much so that there's national guidance. I think it was the Irish first put out really good guidance on building work and aspergillosis specifically, and it was adopted in Scotland. It's been, I mean, I was aware of it back in Crosshouse days. It's just really established that this is a threat, and that the premise behind air sampling is to give you the heads up before you get a case. So you want to monitor before case, but there is, strictly speaking, there is no national guidance.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
I just want to take one point from you in relation to paragraph 124, because there's a reference there to Mrs. Devine saying they were working on improvement. So presumably there's something to improve, but there was no benchmark. And then there's a discussion about the resource to do work on rates of line infection. And the only point I want to ask you about is that Dr. Armstrong says there's a focus piece of work being carried out, and it was suggested Ian Kennedy would take this forward. Now, Dr. Kennedy says it wouldn't have been him and he knows nothing about it. Could you have misremembered what name was used?
No, not at all. That I have to check if it was in the minutes. But it was, I remembered because it didn't seem like the right person to do it.
Thank you. Now, we can move on. As I say, I'm not going to take you to each one of your issues because that will probably take more time than we readily have. But if we go on to 144 of the electronic bundle, I see you made the suggestion of there being, in paragraph 126, we should have a patient placement policy, to which the answer is, well, why don't you send us the ones you've seen elsewhere?
Yes.
Okay. Then you were discussing in 127 single room, air exchange is half of the recommended standard, so that's roughly 3 as against 6. Chilled beams, which you picked up on, and David Loudon says Dumfries have got them. That's the answer. Then in 128 on page 145, discussion on infection rates, and Mrs. Devine says, oh, well, there's been a survey and our rates are fine. Well, and I'm paraphrasing a more complex answer. And you said, well, that doesn't pick up what we're looking at. Is that
Yes,
the essence
exactly.
of the point?
Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's a point about cleaning and dishwashers, where I think the point you were making was acknowledged,
Yes.
in part at least.
Yes.
Then water quality.
Sorry, Mr. Connell. I apologise for interrupting again. Perhaps just briefly, Dr. Peters, the system in place was not designed to pick up the kind of infections we were seeing. Could you maybe just tease that out just a little?
So point prevalence is, it's supposed to be on 1 day, but it can go over to 2 days, where, if depending on your resource. So you have a team of people just going around all the wards and assessing if there are HAIs, hospital-acquired infections, on the wards. And that's a point prevalence, just 1 point in time, it's like a slice. Whereas this kind of problem is a long problem, and you get peaks. It will not pick up. If you had an outbreak last week, it won't pick it up. So, for example, it's no good for norovirus if you do it in August, because you have winter vomiting virus. So it doesn't, it's one way of slicing the onion, if you like, just that way.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cole.
I'm obliged. I dealt with 129, and I was just touching briefly on 130, where one of the points, and we've heard about this elsewhere, was requests for information about water sampling not being responded to for whatever reason. And again, Mr. Loudon seems to come in and say, well, we've got a policy for water sampling. And you say that he made it clear he thought you had no business querying anything to do with the water system.
Yeah.
Was that something said or something you inferred?
I can't remember the wording of it. That's what I took from it, but I can't remember his specific words on it. The impression I was left with was, this is an estates issue. He's head of estates. He's telling me there's no issues with water. Those weren't his words. I can't remember his precise words, but it was. That's what I took from it. It's like, why is water even in this S bar?
Thank you. Can we go on to 146, which touches on a point I think we've possibly taken from you at least briefly earlier, where Mr. Powery then chips in and says, well, we do water testing, we report the failures to infection control. You hadn't seen the history, so you didn't know what the answer to that was. But of course, this was in October 2017. And we know there was a Legionella test in 2015 that somebody somewhere knew about originally. And I think we know that at some point in late 2017, DMA Canyon were back in the building doing work. There was no mention of these in this meeting at all.
In retrospect, it is striking that we could be sat there talking with 3 consultant microbiologists, one of them very, very experienced in microbiology, Dr. Redding, expressing concerns about water and the possible link with infections, and for that information to be there in the background and not shared. There'd by this time been audits. There was a second lot of DMA. There could not be assurance on the water system now that we know what we know. But we were given absolute assurance.
Now, you quite rightly say you raised a number of other issues and time was beginning to run out. And you just mentioned at the foot of that page, talking about an unhealthy culture. Jonathan Best is who? He's the
He
chief.
was the COO by
COO,
then.
yeah.
He'd taken over from Grant Archibald.
Right. So the response to you say, sorry, Dr. Redding saying that roles run clear and you say there's an unhealthy culture, he leans back and says, that's just your opinion.
Yes.
And you say, well, it's not just mine, there are others. Now, can I just ask you a couple of things about the SBAR that I've been asked to put to you? In the SBAR, one of the sections deals with water quality and water testing, and it has an initial dateline of 2015. Who prepared that bit of the SBAR? Do you know?
I did. I prepared the whole of it, really, and then we sat down and checked. I checked with the others. So because there was such a timeline and I was tasked with it, I authored it and then made sure that somebody else, my colleague, the water testing in relation to 2017, and which really was the trigger for us going to this whistleblowing step 1, was the third colleague at that meeting who had been asking for water testing and was very frustrated that it wasn't being done.
And the question that's being raised is in that section, and I don't think we need bother digging it out. There's a mention of a number of risk organisms, Legionella, Stenotrophomonas, and Mycobacteria. Who picked these?
Me.
That was you?
Out of just knowledge of water systems.
Was there any particular reason for picking these, or were they just ones that had cropped up?
I think they're the big ones. I was conscious of Mycobacterium because of the M. abscessus situation with CF. So I knew that was a possibility. So that was probably why Mycobacterium was in my mind.
Thank you. Now, after that meeting ended, we see from page 147 of the electronic paragraph 135 that your colleague said, basically, I want out of this infection control role, and there was a meeting to discuss, and then you sent another SBAR off explaining a number of the issues. In the next section, you're heading ongoing infection concern. So presumably everything hadn't resolved itself. Is that right?
Definitely not.
And you were meeting with Susie Dodd.
Yes.
Now, I have some question to ask you here. You say on the 13th of October, you grew Mycobacterium shalloni
Yes.
from a showerhead. Well, can I just ask you, what were you doing sampling a showerhead in 7D?
I was looking for Mycobacterium abscessus. So this was carrying on with this investigation to assure ourselves that we weren't getting cross-transmission. So that situation had evolved, and I had managed to get agreement that we would get all the abscessus isolates that we had, whole genome sequenced in St Andrews University by Prof. Stephen Gillespie's group, who are expert in mycobacterial genomics. Because I thought that was really going to help us ascertain both the history and the current status of M. abscessus. We're not the only centre to have had issues with cystic fibrosis. There are a number of other centres, and there was an uncertainty about how it was being transmitted, whether it was airborne from person to person or whether it was actually waterborne, or if it was decontamination of shared equipment. So others had already, in other centres, I know Papworth had looked and had struggled to grow it from taps, and but the ecology of the organism is that it is likely in water type situations. So I thought I would give it a go. I'd spoken to Newcastle, who are the experts in, I think it's the Perry group, they designed agar plates so that you can grow it instead of using the laboratory methods for growing TB. It's very specific to the NTMs, that's the non-tuberculous mycobacterium. So I had agreed to have a look in our current setting, because we'd moved from the old setting, Gartnavel, York Hill, so they weren't going to be an ongoing risk if that was the original problem. But what I couldn't assure myself of was, are we sure we don't have it here in our CF ward? So it was just an attempt. And I grew M. cheloni, which I was not looking for, and we didn't have cases of M. cheloni in CF. And as far as I was aware, we didn't have M. cheloni cases.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because you grow this unexpected organism. I take it's an organism of concern.
In certain circumstances, so yes, in high risk areas it is. So which is why I escalated it to Brian Jones, because he was still lead ICD.
So Professor Jones, Jackie Bauman-Roy and Ms. Ioannidis.
Yeah, because she sat on the water group.
And you copied in the cystic fibrosis consultant, so they were aware.
Yes.
And Professor Jones says he and the ICNs will take it on. Left to you, what would you have done about finding M. cheloni on the ward? Was there some obvious action that should have been taken?
Yeah, I think so. It does grow, like in the laboratory. If you can grow it from taps in lots of places. It's all about context. So I think it would be, how wide an issue is this? Is there a problem with our showers not being maintained? There's lots of routes that you would go down. I would have said is, A, do we have any cases? So do a good look back. I had a look back in CF and couldn't see any cases. But in terms of other cases, I think there should have been a look back. There could also have been checks on the water group. Do we have everything in place? It's just an opportunity to do another check through all the things that ought to be in place in a risk in a sort of a proper risk mitigation strategy. And then also, where else could this be that might matter? But if you knew the history of the water system, you would more rapidly take it further. So I think if that's all you knew, it may take you a bit longer to get there. But instantly it would be about that ward. How widespread is it? Is there a problem with showers? Is there a problem with taps? Where else could it be? but it is a clue to there maybe being something around the water system not being right. I think if I'd known what I know now, it was more of a red flag.
Well, I've been asked to ask you a little bit more about Mycobacterium shaloni,
Sure.
some of which takes us a little bit out of order, but it's probably easier to just do it in a block at the moment. At that point, were you aware of a 2016 case in Ward 2A of the same organism?
A 2016?
Yes.
No. I am now.
You are now, but you weren't
then.
at that time. And are you now aware that there was then a case in June 2018?
Yes,
of Mycobacterium
I knew about that case.
shaloni?
I was involved in that case.
You were involved in that case. And am I right in thinking that it's a difficult organism to treat in a patient?
Yes, it is. It's slow growing and resistant, very resistant. And you really need your immune system to be intact to deal with it. So you kind of have to wait for your immune system to regenerate, to be able to clear it with the cells. So you need cellular immunity to clear it.
And does it require possibly more than one antibiotic, or is it?
Toxic, very toxic antibiotics. It's similar to, abscessus. This group of organisms are generally very difficult to treat. You need long-term treatment. You need very toxic antibiotics that can cause big problems. So I've experience of treating Mycobacterium abscessus in pediatrics and adults now, and it's a hard journey for the patients. They cause a lot of nausea, a lot of allergies, renal problems. It really isn't a good organism.
Is there any particular reason why this organism is such an issue to treat? Or is it
Just the biology of it. It's cell wall, and it has a very thick cell wall, mycotic cell wall. So it is intrinsically. It's also it gets established in little micro abscesses, and then the antibiotics can't necessarily penetrate right in. So there's a couple of issues as to why it's difficult. And also we haven't found the right antibiotics, I guess, yet.
Are you aware that there was a case of the same organism in 2019?
Yes.
And were you aware of it being found in bedrooms, told in bedrooms, Ward 2A, when the ward was empty?
No.
I suppose that the general question I've been asked to raise with you is, given what you now know about this organism and what you know about the difficulties of treating a patient if they contract a problem with it, is there any issue about how you think this organism was treated in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
I think at that stage, there should have been more interest shown in the high-risk settings to whether it was there or not. There was unfortunately in the literature, there's mainly outbreaks described. So in Edinburgh, I had an outbreak, but it was associated, I think, with a tattoo parlour. So you have one central source, and lots of people get a very similar organism. And that's very different from other settings where you've got potentially lungs being infected over time, again from this diverse environmental source. It also does exist in other places outside the hospital. So it's back to that idea of just because an organism can be found outside a hospital doesn't mean you should ignore it in a hospital, because a hospital setting is so specific. You get high bioburden in vicinity, in close proximity with very immunocompromised patients with breaches in their skin. So yes, I think it should have triggered actions. And my understanding was that it was taken and discussed at the water group. I don't have emails to that effect, but my understanding, because I followed it up, and again, it unusually for me wasn't in writing. My understanding was it was taken up with the water group. So yes, in retrospect, more could have been made at that point of it. And if there had been a previous case, that could have been typed with the ones that I'd got. Even though there's a big long gap, you would maybe start to understand what's going on. But that original case, and I had looked back into that case, it was picked up by the microbiology team. In our telepath system, I don't have visibility on any infection control input. I think Alison Balfour had authorised the result, so that's as much as I know. But we were at that point separate teams, so that I don't recall any discussion like a morning handover or anything, because there wouldn't have been. So it's an example of lost knowledge that may have made a difference.
Thank you. I think I can probably just finish a sort of section of your statement, because after the Mycobacterium shilloni find that we've discussed at some length, you talk about becoming aware of an issue about air quality in the Teenage Cancer Trust ward, with people not being very sure whether anything's being done about it. And you go on in 139 to talk about the fact that you were trying to cope with the issue that no one was prepared to pick up the baton of being ICD. Right?
Yes, so we had 3 ICDs, as I mentioned, and they all wrote a letter of, we say resignation, but it's, we don't want to do this anymore. Yep. All 3 of them, which left me in a position where we still didn't have Theresa Inkster. We were low in consultants and low in trainee numbers, very low. And I have a number of communications with Brian Jones as my lead, says, what can we do here? You can't just drop a infection control service. I'm very aware of that. So we agreed that for the short term, because once again, I took the opportunity to say there are such big problems here. It's not normal for all these ICDs over time to be refusing to do it. And some of them have a very big interest in infection control. So what we agreed for a short term was, and I spoke to my colleagues, and it took some work, because we were all flat out. We were covering extra weekends and everything, but to say, look, until this is properly sorted by senior management, can we all agree to take a turn to man the rota? So I would have microbiology. I just added an extra column to our rota because I did the rotas, and we'd have blood cultures, ITU, pediatrics, and I added a 4th column, infection control. And I would ensure that there would be nobody double hatting on the same day to allow you to have the whole day. It was tricky because, and I know I've been criticised about this situation, but we all had different days that people worked. So some people are off Monday, Tuesdays. By this time, I'd given up being off on a Thursday, Friday. I just was working my off days because we were so short. We had, for example, Alison Balfour did 1 session a week for infection control. So then she had to agree to do maybe 2 because she was only half-time. And so there wasn't the ability within the staffing to say, right, we'll have somebody on for a week, which would have been ideal, or 2 weeks or a month, just for continuity. We couldn't do that. And then there was annual leave and there was sick leave on top of it. So some days it was literally who's turned up today and how can we man infection control and give it priority? And because we were getting there was so little input from the SMT in infection control, I wanted to ensure that everybody knew what was going on. I set up an email box so that you could, if you were on for the day, you could have access to everything that's been said. So there's nothing hidden. The whole team have access to what's coming in and what's going out. And I did an SBAR of a risk assessment of this setup because it was acknowledged by everybody. This is not great. And I pointed out what the risks were. I tried to mitigate the risks within the confines of what we had. And also, almost immediately, the ICNs did say that it was difficult because they didn't know who was on for the day. And I think sometimes some people were better at picking up the emails than others, perhaps. But then what we did with that was share with them our rota so that they could see who was supposed to be on. That sometimes changed because of sick leave, as I say. Some people had other health issues at the time. So it really was a sticking plaster situation, and there was a lot going on. If you see the handovers, there was an awful lot going on at the time. Sometimes I would try and make a run, so rather than one day, I would say maybe I'll do 3 days and then somebody else will do it. And I think people said I'd taken over infection control, which is absolutely not true, but I was very aware that some people really struggled to do it and really did not like doing it. So I would sometimes pick up somebody else's session. And then I would usually go through the handover and try and make sure none of the balls were dropped. So we'd go through lists of handovers, 10, 11, 12 issues and say, right, where are we at with this? So it was inefficient, but it was trying to be as safe as possible so that nothing got missed and checking that people knew which meetings they had to go to and all of that. So, yeah.
Thank you. What if I might just take one more matter, my lord, just before we have a break? Can we go on to 148? I'm going to ask you about paragraph 140, the piece of string comment I just want to get to. Can we have bundle 14, volume 1, 746, please? I'm just trying to, perhaps we'll need to scroll down to see where the email chain starts, if we could. Right. Yeah. Now, what seems to have happened in this instance, as I understand it, is that you were the microbiologist covering pediatrics, and Professor Gibson, who we've heard from, says, well, we're going to introduce antifungal prophylaxis following a recommendation from Brian Jones. And you say, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'll try and find out. And you ask him about it, and he says, well, it's to do with the situation. What did you understand him to mean by that?
The air quality, Aspergillus being grown, a beginning of a realization that there were still ventilation issues there. I don't know. I assume I was surprised that he had that input because he didn't have a pediatric remit. He was the microbiologist for the bone marrow transplant Scotland wide. So I think it was in that role that Prof. Gibson had approached him.
Can we go back to 746 on the email to see if we can find? We see near the foot of that page, you're saying to Brian Jones, thanks, that's helpful. Would I be right in anticipating the length of prophylaxis would be around 5 weeks? And there were no doubt various issues about continual prescribing of any prophylactic drug. And then the answer comes from him as how long is a piece of string? Hard to be prescriptive. And then he says having HEPA filtered rooms under positive pressure would help. And I've made that point, and your reply is, yeah, we've been making that for a while.
Yes.
In fact, for more than a while, I think, by that time.
Yeah, 2.5 years almost.
2.5 years. Thank you. I think that might be an appropriate point, Malone, to stop, if that's all right.
Yes. We'll take our coffee break, Dr. Peters, and if I could ask you to be back for 12.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Connell.
Now, Dr. Peters, can we bring back your witness statement at, yes, 148? Those are coinciding, even better. In paragraph 142, which starts there and runs on to 149, you're telling us about some mold issues in 2A, but the underlying point that you're making, I think, there is that here we are in 2017, and you still really don't know anything about the ventilation spec for that specialist ward.
I think we didn't know the specific, we didn't have a solid, secure, evidenced understanding and of what the baselines were. So there was great confusion as to, even though sampling was being done, what did it mean? So this was 2 years, over 2 years since the unit opened, and you could argue day one, this should have been a very straightforward exercise. So yes, I mean, I've used the word farcical, which seems strong, but it really at that point was. Because there's a lot of experience in the hospital, more so than any other setting in Scotland around air sampling. And we didn't seem to be able to pull together a rational way of dealing with it, and a systematized SOP, agreed courses of actions, even though all of that was just routine previously.
I'm going to move on, if I may, go on to 149, please. In paragraph 144, you're dealing with the fact that is the chronology, which was that was a point at which you got an update, at least, on your whistleblowing, which was a response about communications. And I think to some extent I asked you about this particular issue about communications earlier in your evidence, so I'm not going to go
Yes.
back to that now. So if we go to 145, which is on page 150 of the electronic version. So here we have a different individual featured, not the colleague that we've been talking about previously, not Dr. Redding, but now Pepe Valerecki.
Very I'm sorry, I've conflated. I thought this was the situation we were talking about earlier with the flapping and the leak testing. So this is what this paragraph is about.
Yeah.
And the earlier one in August must have been an earlier situation that the other ICD at the time had raised concerns about. And that was to do with something different. That was to do with sealing the ceiling tiles, because that makes sense because it was predated. And that was the occasion that that we had a meeting with Brian Jones. So I'm sorry, I jumped to this case because it was in my mind. So there's two situations. Back in August, there was trying to seal the ceiling tiles, and that was the other colleague who had concerns about it, and the HEI scribe. And that was when I escalated to Jennifer Armstrong after Brian Jones had asked me to. This is the same ward, and it's the follow-on piece of work, because once the ceiling tiles are sealed, you need to do a leak test. So that narrative I gave earlier actually fits in with this. I'm sorry, I got the timing muddled up.
Well, I think we'll find the narrative in your witness statement.
Yes, I think it's right in the statement. I think I jumped ahead.
Conveniently through it. But Dr. Valerecki is another of the ICDs, is that right?
Yes.
And is this the same issue again, that someone doesn't feel happy being asked to sign off?
Yes.
I mean, you say she was very upset.
She was.
So Professor Leonard's already signed off two things, and Professor Jones, according to this, is asking Dr. Valaraki to sign off? Why isn't Professor Jones signing it off?
I don't know.
Anyway,
I think that's why she copied me into the emails, because she felt he should do it, but he was tasking her, and as her line manager, she was looking for support.
so you said, well, this is the bit that I think you
Yes,
described to us earlier, where
Yes,
you said, well, we'll just go up and have a look,
yes,
basically.
yes,
And then what you describe is getting to the ward and discovering that
yes,
there was dust. And I think you explained to us that one of the issues at the time was that pressure testing,
yes,
leak testing, I think,
yes,
was being done by the use of quite significant air pressures. Hence, dust was blowing. And there was the concern simply, are there patients within reach of all this dust that were blowing around?
exactly.
Yeah. So what Dr. Valaraki had been asked to sign off, as you say in 148, was actually leak testing. And there was no debate about it. You say she had a coughing fit in the middle of it.
Yes, yes,
So you're the line manager, your member of staff has come very upset, so you've offered to help, you've gone up, and you then try to get information, I think, to assist you in signing off. Is that right?
yes,
I think at the foot of 148, you talk about trying to get something from Sandra Devine and not having much success.
yes.
So is that a similar tale to the one you've told us previously?
Yes, because inherent in signing off a piece of work like that is understanding what the purpose of the piece of work is. So I think there could be a view that somebody signed off the overarching project and this is just a small part of it. And so what's the big deal? Just sign it off. My view is to do a competent job, you need to understand where in the process it is, what's the point of it, have you adequately addressed the issues for this part of the project, and how does it relate to the bigger project? So it's a matter of informed, competent decision making and risk mitigation in the context of patients on site. And I think it was with verbal conversations with between Brian and Dr. Valaraki, that she should just get it done with my help. She'd at that stage, I don't think, signed off scribes, so there was an element of me showing her the scribe, what I would probably do with it. So it was the same root cause.
And what you did was you set up a meeting to discuss it.
Yes, because on this occasion there were, as I said earlier, actual immunocompromised patients in the same ward where the air was potentially going in, and the treatment room was in the middle of the scribe area. So in any other setting, in any time I've had to stop a scribe, so you can say, stop, this is not safe, to whoever's doing the work. And then you obviously need to speak to the clinicians, you need to pull together estates, you need to pull together the appropriate people. I've had experience of having to do exactly that in Crosshouse and also at the Queen Elizabeth in another setting. And that's what you need to do. You need to do this safely. There isn't a route out of doing work in a hospital unsafely. That's just not a deal. So unfortunately, I didn't get any support in trying to get this meeting together. And I did it with Dr. Valaraki. And there was, normally you'd just say to the team, infection control team, would like to organise this meeting, and the secretarial support for the infection control team would contact the key people. It's very routine, it's what the team does. Book a room, get minutes taken, all of that sort of thing. But there was no support for that. It was just flat out, we don't think this is necessary. So I just went ahead and booked a room and pulled together people. I had informed Rachel Green by this stage, because it was after our meeting with Jennifer Armstrong, was obviously taking a large interest in how infection control was working. So she said she would come along to the meeting because I informed her of it. And she came along to the meeting, and we got clinicians who I thought were the right clinicians, but they apparently weren't the right clinicians. But that was part and parcel of just not having the support to pull together the correct people. I thought I had the correct people around the table. And we went through what I thought was a really standard approach to an HAI scribe, in which you find that there are problems in a high-risk unit. But it was a very, very difficult meeting.
One of the issues that you highlight in paragraph 150, which we get on 151 of the electronic bundle, is that one of I think the nurses there says, oh, the doctors say there's not a problem, and you'd been told, well, there was a problem because people were having to be put on a prophylaxis because of the works.
Yes.
There seemed to be a question about whether you were causing a delay to works when people were very keen to get this job finished.
And I mean, it's understandable. They'd been off-site for a long time, and they've been promised deadline after deadline. But my position is always, well, you can't do a piece of work properly and safely if you don't follow the well-established HAI scribe process. So yes, it's unfortunate that there is a delay, but you don't weigh up one risk against the other. What you say is you do the scribe properly, and that will actually ensure that you get there faster. So there was no buy-in, I felt, around the table that this was actually an issue. I think there was what's a bit of dust in the air type feeling.
The one thing I just wanted to ask you about, who remind us who Dr. Green is?
She was chief of medicine for diagnostics.
Because you record here being told not to contact Health Protection Scotland.
Yes.
Were you told why you were not to contact them?
No. It's not the first time in Glasgow I'd been told not to go outside the organisation or got in trouble for speaking to So one time I spoke to Mr. Hoffman, and I got in trouble for that, which is, consultant colleagues across the country, if you have something you don't know much about, or you just phone round people that you think, obviously you're not giving patient details, but you're asking for expertise, a bit of peer support. There's a feeling that in Glasgow you keep everything tight inside, and there are only certain approved routes of anything going outside. So it's a very controlled environment. And for somebody like me, just to pick up the phone to HPS was absolutely unacceptable. But I had been told that HPS had signed off. Again, the word signed off. HPS would never do an HI Scribe 4 or a specific setting or a Scribe 3. So that seemed odd to me.
And it turned out they didn't know anything about it.
No, because I went ahead and emailed them.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, can we move into 2018? I'm conscious that at certain parts of your statement, you're narrating material which comes significantly from Dr. Inkster or from discussions with Dr. Inkster.
Yes.
And of course, we'll hear from Dr. Inkster.
Sure.
So we may be able to move past some of these, but can we go on to 152? So we're in January 18. Dr. Inkster comes back from sick leaves and then resigns. And you're not very happy with that. And apparently that you understand Dr. Inkster shares some of your concerns, but
Yes.
Somehow she stays on at that point. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you then narrate some information about the Cooper Vidius case. Now, Dr. Inkster had dealt with that, and there was a question about what the link was. I don't think we need
Sure.
delay you on that one. We see in 155, which is on page 153 electronically, that you were asked by her to attend a meeting that had been organised with estates and so on to discuss PPVL rooms, which you've been talking about on and off since the start of your evidence. And perhaps the interest in that meeting is the appearance of Mr. Thomas, who I think you explained to us earlier was the inventor, or whatever the right word is, of the clever PPVL room concept. And you raised certain issues with him about how you had to put all the bits together to make it match what his design was. Is that right?
Yes.
I think this is covered in 156 in your witness statement, where you're basically saying, well, if you don't put the extract in the right place, does that kind of invalidate what you were trying to do? And he says, yes. And then you note that he says to you verbally, what you've got here doesn't match my design, but you understand that's being taken forward by him with Mr. Perry, is that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
And Mr. Powery was of the same view, I think, from the beginning with me, and we'd done a bit of work with smoke and looking at pressures within a suite. So we were both very much in agreement on this.
That was that the PPVL rooms as built
Exactly.
did not meet the intended design.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm not going to ask you about the next couple of paragraphs. 159, which is on page 154 of the electronic bundle, we're in March. You were asked to test some taps and shower heads, take some samples. You take somebody with you, and you found some gram negatives. Is that right?
Yes, a lot of different gram negatives. Actually, we were initially looking just for Cupria vadis, and this is the difference between just following guidance and having a bit more thinking around a process. So while the initial setting and the task I was given by Dr. Inkster was to look for Cupria vadis, when I looked at the plates, and I could see that there were other organisms. Cupria vadis was growing kind of slightly blue on the plates, so you could actually see them. And there were a number of other organisms, and there was lots of Sphingomonas, some Pseudomonas, and a number of other organisms. So if this had just been guidance driven or an SOP, you maybe just would have reported Cupria vadis. But because I had an awareness that these organisms in this patient cohort could actually also be a big problem, I identified them and reported them. And I noted things like Delphtia, that there had actually been cases with that, and there was Ochrobonus. These are things I hadn't seen in my career before. They're not undescribed. So most organisms, if you go to the literature, you'll find somebody somewhere has seen it. So you're not talking about undescribed things. You're talking about unusual for you. And I did this with a trainee, this work on the taps and shower heads. I wrote a report. I think I must have put it in, yes.
Yeah, but you weren't further involved in the issue of taps. That wasn't something you got involved in.
No, I was just given those taps and showers, and I wrote up my methodology, wrote up what I did, and sent it into the IMT, and that was the end of that.
Before we move to June 2018, which is your next heading, if just so we've got that clear, go to 155. Yeah, so before we go to June 18, I want to ask you about a document that came into existence just before that, which relates to your whistleblowing case. Now, I don't want to ask you great detail about this because we know a lot of the issues that you've raised, but could we have Bundle 27, Volume 3, 472, please? This, as we can find out if we ultimately scroll to the end, has been produced by Linda de Keestecker in
Yes.
May 2018 and is a report on a stage of your whistleblowing process.
Yes.
And we can forget the introductory and background material because that would be repetitive of what we already have. But if we can go on to 473, perhaps the interesting thing is that she says she interviewed because we find she interviewed Dr. Kennedy, Dr. Jones, Mr. Walsh, Sandra Devine, Dr. Green, Dr. Inkster, and Marianne Kane.
Yes.
Doesn't seem to have interviewed other ICDs, for instance.
No.
And then she sets out findings and issues, and we can all see what they say. But the some quite interesting discussions here. If you look on to 474, she says she discusses with the lead infection control doctor 3 versus 6 air changes. So that's presumably the ordinary room. Building note recommends 6 air changes, so that'll be SHTM 0301.
Yes.
However, the infection control team considers the additional risk to patients in standard accommodation is negligible, as 3 air changes brings contamination down to 5% in a single accommodation. Were you aware of any such discussion with the infection control team?
Definitely not. That is not, doesn't make sense. That 3 air changes brings contamination down to 5% doesn't even sound right from the graphs, and also 5% of, for example, if you had somebody coughing up lots of XDR TB, or because they may have to be housed in 5C before they get moved across to the other place, it's significant. So A, it's not right, and B, there is no risk assessment I am aware of that came to that conclusion.
The next paragraph says that Mrs. Kane has confirmed that an expert is being recruited on a part-time fixed-term basis to specifically look at ventilation in the Queen Elizabeth hospitals and to make recommendations. Were you aware of that?
No, not aware at all. And just going back to the 6 versus 3, I think it's also important to note that it's the importance of 6 air changes is not just, say, a single contamination issue, like you have one cough. The 3 versus 6 is the longevity of it. So the steady state, if you like, is much, much higher with 3 versus 6. So it's not just about the time it takes to clear. And that becomes very important in COVID. So there's a problem with that. And no, I did not know that anybody was being asked to. I now know there was a Jim Leiper report, but no.
Well, I just need to put to you a couple of things before I leave this. We've seen who was interviewed, and at the foot of the page we're looking at the moment, which is I think the 3rd page of the report, but 474 on the electronic documents. There's a note saying Drs. Redding and Peters raised concerns that were not being updated. I discussed these concerns with everyone interviewed, so presumably the people who've identified. And then the report back from these people is that you find it difficult to accept balance of risk. You don't accept being part of a team listening to views of others. You don't accept infection control as a nurse-led service. You said frequent requests for updates which are not relevant, and you've caused great anxiety to colleagues. Now, do you accept these criticisms?
No. I mean, I sent a lot of emails, as you can see, and as far as I'm concerned, every single one was a necessary part of my job. They related to real situations, real patients, real risks, and in the absence of any other route or methodology for communicating those things, then that was really the way to do it.
Can we go on to 475? Now, there's a discussion at the top about issues of ventilation being on a risk register. Then there's a reference to chilled beams on the risk register, and a statement attributed to Ms. Kane saying that infection control doctors were very much part of this process, which presumably must be something to do with the selection of chilled beams. That information that you had?
No.
Now, the only other thing I wanted to put to you, which might, in the context of the evidence you've been giving us, be slightly surprising, is that Dr. Inkster seems to criticise you according to this report, because she says, or she's said to have said in paragraph 2 on that page, agreed that the whistleblowers were right to alert the concerns and their diligence and insight should be acknowledged and respected. Then she says Dr. Peters' behaviour is a problem and needing to know too much detail on issues not within her remit. Is that something you'd heard from Teresa Inkster?
Yes. So there was a period when Dr. Inkster, mainly through the IMT process, felt that I was asking too much of communication. We discussed it, and there were certain things, feedback I got from her about some of the emails I'd sent, things like I'd put responses in red type, and that came across as aggressive. So I took on board these comments and didn't do that again. And also we resolved differences. And I think she had found the IMT, the water process, really, well, obviously it was a massive deal. I had written to ask, I think one of the particular situations with regard to that was the use of prophylaxis. And one of my colleagues had been asked about it when they were on call for microbiology, and they had not had any communication. And a similar thing happened with another colleague on call. They had brought it to me as clinical lead, so I'd written and asked for, basically suggested that the communication had not been adequate. I now understand that actually there had been an email sent to one member of the team which hadn't been shared with everybody. So there was, I think, some basis to this. It was unfortunate. It was not intentional on either of our parts. And we were able, as professionals, to sit down and discuss it and take on board what had happened with that. I had also written at the time a list of reasons. So for me, as the microbiology, one of the microbiologists going and looking after giving microbiology antibiotic advice on 2A, I needed to know who was on Cipro and why, because it's not, you can't just do a blanket, everybody's on ciprofloxacin. It needs to be individually tailored to that particular patient in terms of where they are in their treatment, what their risk profile is, what other antibiotics, and I've got a whole summary of the things that our colleagues and I had in recognizing this was now happening, even though we hadn't been informed. These were the things we had to keep a track of. So I think you'd have to ask Dr. Inkster specifically what she said at that meeting and what she had, what importance she lay by that. And I would say that there was, at that time, there had been difficulties between us, which we were able to overcome.
Can we just move very briefly to the last thing I want to ask you about, which is paragraph 5, conclusion, where it records whistleblowing concerns about ventilation and patient safety were real, but had already been dealt with in the main with action plans for the rest. First of all, would you agree with that statement?
No.
I don't need you to go into the details.
No.
Would you agree with that?
No, I don't.
And then there's a reference to the point we've just discussed. Then there's a slightly general statement. Timescale for some of the improvements required are not sufficiently clear. I'm not sure what that means. And then there's a statement, there is now agreed policy that any changes from building regulations or original specifications must be signed off by infection control. Do you know where that came from?
I think Dr. Inkster had written the role of infection control in the built environment, but I think that had predated 2017. I would need to check on that, but it wasn't new. I mean, this is, this should be in place since 2002. But I think given all that had been experienced, she had felt the need to put together that paper.
Thank you very much. I don't need to look at that any further, unless your lordship wishes to take anything more from it. Now, if we can then move on, we're about to go back. If we go back to your witness statement, just to take that as a guide, we're going into June 18. You've got some more information from Dr. Inkster, this time about drains in 2A. And in paragraph 164, I think what you're explaining there is that someone had said there might be a problem with overprescribing of a particular antibiotic, and you went and did an analysis to try and work out whether there was any truth on that assertion, checking everybody, and it turned out that in fact there wasn't. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's a fair, you do have to look at your antimicrobial prescribing in any context that involves bacteria and their trends. So I was asked, I think Dr. Balfour had also done a piece of work around meropenem use in the unit and had also concluded similar, but this was, what I did for this was not a broad use, but looked at the 17 cases, I think it was, that the IMT had included in their case definition, and I went through each and every one of them and to see if their use of meropenem was justified, I guess, by our protocols and according to what had already been grown, or if they were allergic to other antibiotics. So there are lots of reasons why you might end up using meropenem. It's a very, very useful drug, but there are difficulties associated with it, and it can select out, for example, for Stenotrophomonas and others. But I didn't find that theory explained these cases, and I wrote that up and also made a bit of a recommendation to my colleagues that as I'd gone through it, we need to, keep our documentation tight.
Thank you. If we move on to 156, Professor Gibson wanted a meeting with microbiology, and Dermot Murphy, who I think was one of the other consultants, because of concerns about increasing infections. And what you did, and I think it was you did a presentation, I think with Ms. Harvey Wood, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Which is a sort of PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to ask us to put it up on the screen, but you felt it demonstrated, I think your words are, a striking epidemiology of gram-negative organisms.
Yes.
You think that's an accurate description?
Yes.
And you set out in the rest of paragraph 166 why you say that was, and then you touch on the use of antibiotics, and you pick up the fact that the advice that was given was subsequently approved of by a case note review. So I'm not going to go through that with you. 157, please. This is where you're told about BMT patients moving out of 2A and, patients moving out of 2A and 2B by Dr. Inkster, and you sort of keep in touch, is what you said. I need to ask you one thing about October 18, Dr. Kennedy's report. Now, you weren't very excited by that report, and we see your comments on it. Now, Dr. Kennedy would say, well, I don't remember Dr. Peters setting these comments out to me, and he says that the conclusion of the report was there was a clear increase in gram-negative infections, and further work was needed to understand why. Is that not a sensible conclusion?
I think it failed to pick up on not just the gram-negatives as a whole, but the nature of the gram-negatives and what that would be directing your attention to in terms of what a probable focus would be. It also looked at quite a large, from memory, I don't have it right in front of me, but the denominator data. There are debates around the denominator data. It depends what you're trying to do and depends what you're trying to look at. And the easiest denominator data I had looked at was the number of blood patients with blood cultures as a close proxy for the number of patients, because basically very few patients come in that cohort and don't get a blood culture. So that's what I used as a proxy for the number of individuals coming through and being exposed to our unit. There are pros and cons to every denominator you use, but I didn't think it went far enough in delineating what the problem and the interesting bit of the epidemiology was. And I did have conversations with them, because I remember we decided that I would give my Kai's, because our figures didn't always match. And so because our gathers it's Kathleen Harvey-Wood's data, really. She was very particular about keeping her data sets up to date. And she would do a gather in our telepath system that was based on consultants rather than location, because often these patients could be scattered about the hospital, including PICU. So she had a very granular view, and she would know each patient by name and exactly what had happened to them, what their clinical. So she had a very, very close-up view, and her data was excellent. So I was kind of piggybacking onto her excellence. And Ian Kennedy was using a different approach. So there was a view Teresa felt, I think I sent it to Teresa, I'd had the discussions with Teresa, and there was an idea that, right, let's nail this. Why do we have discrepancies? What Ks are we actually talking about? Who are we talking about? And any data, it depends on what question you're asking of the data as to what you pull out. So, yeah, I think he maybe has a fair point with the conclusion, but I think it was going further. That was what my concern was.
Thank you. Can we go on to 158, please? And we're going to move into apart from a general statement about negative pressure rooms still not being ready, which you've quite properly recorded there, we're going to come in to just touch at least briefly on Cryptococcus. Now, we've heard from a number of witnesses that Cryptococcus in a healthcare setting is unusual, to put it no higher. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And had you come across it before in a healthcare setting?
In terms of treating patients, yes, but not with any question of it having been acquired in hospital. So I treated or been involved in the treatment of a case, 2 cases, maybe 3, with a slightly less involvement in the course of my career before these cases occurred. So I have a good knowledge base of the organism, its link to pigeon guano, and also its general epidemiology in the HIV setting, because that's really where most of the information has come to light with that organism globally.
Yep. What we then come to, I think, is a narrative discussion of a number of patients where you had occasion to look at what had happened to them in the context of potential Cryptococcus. I think the first one starts in paragraph 172, and this is somebody who'd been treated on ward C, and I take it this is you checking the records to see what is available about this particular individual.
Yeah, so I was copied into this email, so I was clinical lead still. One of our trainees had picked up the organism and was emailing Prof. Jones in his role as the microbiologist for the bone transplant unit. So I discussed it with the trainee, and I had not seen it in that patient cohort before. I had not got a lot of experience in BMT, but I do in hemato-oncology out with the BMT setting, and also Teresa has a lot of BMT experience. So this was, yes, an unusual case. So I would have gone through the case, and also second case, we by this time had managed to recruit another microbiologist who left after 6 months for a lot of the reasons and concerns that we had been raising, but he mentioned, because we try and have coffee, most days to just touch base on what's going on, and he mentioned a pediatric case, and the way I was able to pick up that there were 2 was I was aware of this first case, and it was striking to me that these 2 should occur so closely together, and I said, you have to tell Teresa, who's the infection control doctor.
Yeah. So just moving through your witness statement, having looked at various factors in relation to this individual patient, you reached a conclusion in 174 that the illness was compatible with Cryptococcus consistent with an HAI.
Yes.
That's the view that you formed.
Yes.
And then if we go on to the next page, 159 on the electronic, paragraph 175, you're then told there's a pediatric
Yes.
case, and that, I think, raises alarm bells with you and say, we've got to go and tell Dr. Inkster, and I think you say here, must be pigeons somewhere.
Yeah.
Because of the well-known link, and you were asked in particular to help with the plant room inspections, and we've heard quite a lot about plant
Sure.
room inspections already in the inquiry, and you're also asked to contact Mr. Hoffman. Seems to be the default position is phone Peter Hoffman.
He's very accessible, or he was before he retired.
So by accessible, you mean he's quite happy to speak to people on the phone?
Yes.
I take it, rather than you're insisting you send him a request or a form or something.
Yes. And I've met him before. We actually we went to India to do an infection control workshop and series of lectures. So I've known, to enable me to phone and talk sensibly about the kind of issues that we were needing to know about.
I think I can move past some of this reasonably quickly because we've already heard a fair amount of evidence about it. We go to January 2019. You've been asked to contact Mr. Hoffman. You go to plant rooms with Mr. Powerby and Mr. Connor to see what can be found, and you explain that that there was some sign of pigeon guano, the latest word we're using for it. So 160. It turned out that Mr. Connor had access to other pictures, and we've discussed that with him. And we see in paragraph 181, you're talking to Colin Purton about how the pigeons get in and whether there's a gap in cladding and so on, which I don't think we need to delay on. But you say, well, there's all this pigeon infestation, there must be a risk that some of it's getting to the patients.
Yes.
Now, what 182, you say that states and public health teams continually challenge any view that the plant rooms and the like were the possible source. I think Dr. Kennedy denies mocking your views at all.
Oh, it wasn't my views, it was Teresa's at an IMT, so this was reported to me. So the direct to me was the estates personnel. So when I did the plant room visit, there was a lot of emphasis by Mr. Coroner, Darrell, on there's hardly any pigeon excreta here. There's just small amounts. There was always not that much. So that was the tone of a lot of discussions with the states. There wasn't that much of it. So really, how big a risk can it be? Whereas this was, Teresa reported to me that at the IMT, well, this is secondhand, I admit that. So it's maybe best to ask her that. But we were comparing notes about how we felt nobody was listening to us. And we certainly expressed the view, and we're not the only ICDs to feel that there is a very strong flavour of sexism throughout this, that we were females talking about engineering issues and in general not being treated with the same level of respect as our male colleagues. So I think that's what that is, but I agree that that is not to me by Ian Kennedy, and it is secondhand.
Well, if Dr. Kennedy and you are not directly involved, we'll take that up elsewhere, and then you have a discussion about the board statement. And in fact, you continue to do something about looking at pigeons on and off, because there's an issue about mucor, which you said is a similar arrangement. Am I right in thinking that you have information indicating there have been more recent cases of Cryptococcus?
Yes, there's an interesting emerging epidemiology, I would say, in Glasgow, that there have been 4 I'm aware of. I don't know because I'm not monitoring them, but I'm just aware through my practice of there having been 4 cases in the last 18 months or so, within that time frame, which, according to the data in reports that we've seen in Glasgow, you're sort of expected rate would be 1 or less than 1 a year. So that is still, and what's striking with it is, as it was with all the cases in 2018, is that they all have a link to our hospital premises. In and of itself, that is not conclusive, but it is something worth exploring and keeping an eye on, because if you've got immunocompromised patients in a setting where you have less than standard ventilation, even in settings where there's only the 3 air changes, that is increasing by a significant degree the amount of air being breathed in that could be contaminated. And if on top of that you have within the vicinity of the building a lot of the source material, put that together, you really need to be following up the epidemiology within those immunocompromised patient groups who may have had a link, who have had a link to the hospital. There are, of course, pigeons in other places. The case I'd originally seen in my was somebody who looked after pigeons, they had pet pigeons. So there are other explanations, but it's enough of an epidemiology with a link to a particular floor in the building that I would expect our high to be after this incident. Whether anybody agrees with a solid conclusion about the link, or sometimes problems emerge over years. And because the incubation period of Cryptococcus can be so long, into years, or you can get reactivation many, many years later, the exposure could either be historic and therefore things may not emerge for years, or they could be ongoing pigeon problems. I have no data to tell me which of those is, but somebody somewhere, I hope, is monitoring it.
Thank you. Can we move on to 161? We can skip past 184. 185 was the point I was making about mucor, was something you were asked to look at, and you had a bit of an issue with Mrs. Devine on wording. Then in 186, which we'll find mainly on page 162 of the electronic bundle, you describe a visit from the HSE, and I don't want to ask about that, other than the end of 186, this is 162, you record something here. Tom Steele stated he had commissioned a review from concept to build and commissioning to explore why the hospital had not been built to specification. Is that something that you'd been told about during any of your exchanges about the hospital environment?
No, this was the first time, which seemed like a good idea actually, but this was, yeah. So he was a new director of estates, and he'd commissioned this review. That he mentioned that when we had the sit-around meeting with HSE, and I was invited to that meeting by Teresa, and I had said the history of the ventilation concerns. They were there because of the cryptococcal cases, and Tom Steele's response to that was that he had commissioned this review, which seemed very good.
Now, in paragraph 188, you narrate an incident involving Professor Jones and yourself. We can see what you've said about it, and I don't need to go through that. I only have one question about it. Can you tell me in very short compass why the exchange was taking place? What people tend not to walk in and start shouting at people without some reason. What was the issue?
So I had a text late at night from Prof. Jones to ask me if there was anything for the head of service. They had a head of service meeting once a month, and I would not hear from Prof. Jones the whole month, and then I would be asked, is there anything for the head of service? So I texted back, as I would, all the issues that were going on, particularly staffing. And there was a response. I mean, I don't know if the details don't matter. It was not a nice response. And then the next day, we had a real staffing crisis. We had deanery visit to visit our trainees, and we had HSC visits, and we had only 2 other consultants. We were so low in numbers that we were all sat in one room in the duty room, trying to man the duty room and also covering the laboratory. And we normally had a column for ITU as well. And Teresa was completely taken up with the cryptococcal IMTs and very, very busy in infection control. So I was really down to skeletal staffing. And I said, we're going to have to phone over to ITU rather than do a physical visit. Now, bear in mind that some ITUs across the city only got a phone call anyway, and at weekends we would just do a phone call. So this, I felt, was the best use of our time, was to focus on getting the laboratory results out, dealing with clinical calls as they came in. And also I had to try and get to the deanery visit. And then he came into the department and just said, I've got an email from Anne Harkness. You're going to be responsible for not giving an ITU ward round, and that's unacceptable, and just started, and that's what triggered it. And I said, well, all the support I've had is you texting last night, and you said this, the thing that was said, and then that just was the trigger for a very rageful incident.
Well, let's just move on, if we can, Dr. Peters. There's some parts I think I can move past quickly, others I need to pause on a little bit for other reasons. In the next section of your statement, you talk about meeting Jean Freeman, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, and you narrate in paragraph 190 on electronic 163 what happened about that meeting.
Yes.
And we can see what you've said in 190 and 191. Now, I'd asked you earlier in your evidence about the DMA Canyon report when you got it, and we see now in your chronological narrative, you explain that you were shown it while you were off ill by Teresa Inkster, so that would date it to the 2019 date. Yes. That you told us earlier. And I think you suggest in paragraph 192 that it's very odd that no one had shown you it before.
Yes.
To put it no higher. I need to ask you a little bit about 193, which is on page 164 of the electronic version, because there's a very short paragraph about an interim report from HPS that I'm not sure whether you can remember what report that was now. Because I think the point I've been asked to put to you in essence is it was, if it was an interim report, was it simply a report that explained that it hadn't had all the information and there were going to be further reports to come, and therefore it's a little difficult to criticize it for being limited?
Sometimes interim reports are just waiting for, sign-offs from other people. So it was what was standing at the time. And the way I took it was, this is our view just now from HPS. This is the data. It was clear about what data they'd looked at. It was clear about what their conclusions were at that point in time. And as more problems emerged, I guess they would carry on. And yeah, to a degree, it's fair that it was interim, but I don't think it's fair to say it didn't warrant some level of scrutiny.
Thank you. I didn't ask you about the Health and Sport Committee, but we note now from May 2019 you're returning to work, and in June 2019, if we go to 165, we'll find that the topic of chilled beams, about which the inquiry has heard a good deal from a number of people, emerges, and I don't need to ask you the detail of it, but as I understand it, this was the incident where it turned out that it wasn't condensation, it was a leak from a joint. Yes. Because there'd been a problem with the boiler and things had contracted and there was a leak. And you were called in, made the appropriate investigations, took some photographs and made an appropriate report. The question that's arisen in the context of another witness is the fact that the chilled beams operate on a sealed system, which is not purified water.
Yes.
So it was that was dripping out.
Yes, and that's precisely why it's a problem.
Yeah, because you then took swabs and certain things were grown from these swabs, suggesting an element of contamination.
Yeah, so we actually published on the experience of chilled beams, and I think it's been referenced in the new HTMs, and other places have referenced it as a learning of the fact that we've got them throughout our hospital. So the infection risks are pretty clear. And this was, I think, pretty major realization that there was an extensive water system accessing patients' rooms that wasn't part of your normal water safety planning.
Right. We could just move on momentarily, please, to 166. So we're getting to July 19. Dr. Inkster's going on leave, and she tells you about various things that are going on. You're trying to clarify ventilation in the PICU and NICU, and we're talking about the same things you're talking about before, which is the need to be clear as to what rooms have what properties, I assume.
Yes.
So going on to 167. About halfway down that page, you're highlighting to Mrs. Devine that some high scribe work purported to have been signed off by Dr. Inkster, but that actually wasn't something she'd signed off.
That's right.
Because she hadn't been there to sign it off.
Yes.
And I think we've heard from other witnesses about the 4B circumstances. And then 206 is perhaps symptomatic rather than central, in that there was an incident of somebody being essentially in the wrong room.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary of what you're saying there?
Yes, that's all. It's just an example of the reason why it's important to get it right.
Yeah. So if we go on just to finish this section to 168, you send an SBAR about PICU ventilation, which is something you've obviously looked at repeatedly, and then you make the point in paragraph 208 that 5 years, you're now 5 years on from being there, and your view is that things still haven't been assessed properly. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, and I was asked to do this. It is odd because Teresa was dealing with it, but there was an urgency when she was annual leave to get this signed off quickly. There was a degree, and also at the same time there was the ice theatres, which are the finally the new neuro theatres were being built, and Teresa was dealing with those, and there was quite a tussle around I would have to sign them off, which isn't ideal. Those sort of projects are best handled by the ICD. So this goes back to me being pulled in, rather than me jumping in and wanting to do things that aren't my remit, actually being tasked with things. And I felt uncomfortable that this was, and I suspect it, well, the feeling that both Teresa and I had was that she was maybe questioning it, and this was an opportunity to get it signed off by somebody else. But in essence, it gets very repetitive by this stage, but unless you change something, you're going to keep coming up with the same problems. And it struck me that nothing had changed in the approach to the infection control risks of the built environment.
I'm conscious of time. I think this might be an appropriate time to take the lunch break.
We'll take our lunch break, and if I could ask you to be back for 2 o'clock.
Sure.
Thank you.
Start.